Hey everybody, welcome to tropical UW-Milwaukee. It's even more tropical here, but we'll be all thinking, boy, it was nice in that hot room tomorrow at this time. We're going to welcome that. Anyway, I'm Jeff Mears from WisPolitics.com. Thanks very much for convening today. This is the last room in the building that has never been touched by construction. So. Anyway, no, it might be yet. Okay, so no, welcome. I mean, the union's going to look terrific after the construction. Thanks for bearing with us on that. Thanks to UW-Milwaukee for providing all the room and the technical assistance and being a sponsor of this event. We want to do more events with the UW-Milwaukee community, and so this is the start of that. If you don't know about WisPolitics.com, check us out at, believe it or not, WisPolitics.com. You can find out all about us there and subscribe to our social media. So I'm going to hand this over. Well, maybe I should just introduce everybody, and then I'll hand it over to Kathy. So, Bill McCoshen, top GOP strategist and former cabinet officer with a department that's no longer there, the Department of Commerce. So. But you helped drive what the replacement is. So Bill's now with Michael Best Strategies. Sachin Chheda, welcome. Nation Consulting, Democratic consultant, and the Fair Maps Coalition. Right, so how's that project going? We'll get to that later. Okay. Go to Michigan. Go to Michigan and find out about it. All right, Bill Glauber, who's filling in for Corey Hess, but he can stand on his own. Certainly, Bill has been going across the state with the candidates. So you have some stories to tell, some of which may actually emerge here today. And then we have Charles Benson, who's the anchor at TMJ4, and we cooperated on some debates this year. And so thank you for that, Charles. Good partner.
Thank you.
All right, and now I hand things over to Professor Kathy Dolan, excuse me. So welcome, and thank you for doing this.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. As Jeff said, this is a really timely and interesting and important panel, and we've got some perfectly situated people to help us make sense of what happened on Tuesday. And if Tuesday told us anything, it showed us that this is why we play the game, right? I mean, we all were expecting a particular outcome. I told my class on Monday afternoon what was going to happen. All of the historical evidence would have suggested to us what we had been calling the red wave. And, all the metaphors for trickling puddles of red water aside, we got exactly the opposite, right? I mean, we had clear Democratic overperformance in many races in many areas of the country. We've got the CNN this morning said that the House of Representatives majority status is still too close to call. We've got 30 outstanding races. It looks like people are projecting, as of an hour ago, that the Republicans will have between 1 and possibly 5 seats in a majority. That is not what they hoped for on Monday. We've still got 3 outstanding Senate races, one that won't be decided until December. So we are, in some ways in the same place we were in 2020, right? A couple days later, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we know what didn't happen. And that, I think, is a significant piece in itself. So we've got, as I said, these 4 people who are sort of uniquely situated to help us make sense of it. I'm going to start with a sort of very general question to ask each of the panelists to give us some sense of something that they thought was perhaps most surprising from Tuesday's results. And then I've got a series of topics that I want to make sure that we hit if nobody addresses them in their comments. And then we'll save some time. I did not bring my phone up and I don't see a clock. So if somebody could give us a signal at about 12:15 or noon to make sure we have enough time for questions. So we can go in whatever order of enthusiasm you have for this first question. But given each of your unique roles, give us some idea of something that really surprised you or that you found to be perhaps one of the most striking takeaways from Tuesday. And we'll start with Charles.
So my role every election is to be surprised. I don't go into an election thinking something is going to happen. And I think that's the best way to approach politics in Wisconsin, because it generally does surprise you. Yeah, I've been out there on the campaign trail, I saw the polls, so there were some expectations. I guess if I were to say two surprises or two things I noticed, is that once again, Wisconsin proving to be a closely divided state. This time around, for the fourth consecutive election cycle, a statewide race was decided by fewer than 30,000 votes. You've heard of the term, the view from 30,000 feet? Well, how about the view from 30,000 votes? That's what pretty much was the difference between Ron Johnson and Mandela Barnes. And then you go back to 2016 and 2020, that was the difference in the presidential, fewer than 20,000. And in 2018, fewer than 30,000. I should say, fewer than 30,000 in the two presidential, fewer than 30,000 in the 2018. My brain is still asleep. I haven't really gotten over the long nights yet. So 4 straight races, fewer than 20,000. The other observation I made, and I'm curious as I'll do a little polling here. Are you still ready to do some polling? We know that the governor and US Senate races were the most expensive in Wisconsin history. And so I would say to you, when you look at what ads you saw over the last month or 2 months, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. How many thought they saw more of the US Senate commercials than any other commercial? How many thought that they saw more of the governor's campaign commercials than any other? And then how many thought that they saw more attorney general? Here's what surprised me. The 2 attorney general candidates got more votes than the losing candidates in the governor and US Senate. Think about that. So all that money spent to get you to buy into a candidate on the US Senate or the governor's race, the attorney general candidates got more votes than the losing candidates in the Senate and in the governor's race. Bill?
I'm not as eloquent as Charles. I covered the Senate race for more than a year. I was quite frankly surprised by the closeness of the outcome. I expected a little bit of a wider margin. I thought it spoke to the strength of both candidates. They both had weaknesses, but as far as campaigners go, they were both very strong campaigners. They had different views. It got nasty towards the end, or frosty. A lot of bitterness there, but I thought it was an interesting race, and you can't say that the state didn't have a choice to make in that race. And by 27,000 votes or so, the state chose the incumbent. The only other thing that surprised me was the continuing Democratic inroads into Waukesha County. If I were a Republican, I would be pretty scared right now, even though they won the one big statewide race. 60-40 Waukesha sort of changes some calculations. And the other surprise, obviously, electorally, is the growth in Dane County and the continuing Democratic numbers out of Dane County, and then Democrats reaching a top in Milwaukee County. So those are some of the trends that these 2 guys over here can probably speak more proficiently about.
I don't know that I was totally surprised. I think that going into Election Day, it seemed like the expectations of a total Republican blowout were a little bit overstated. And even, looking at the polls, it didn't seem like they were telling that story when you have, everything pretty close. I think Bill's going to talk about where the polling came in and how generally pretty accurate it was. I do think that it's interesting and important to note that it has become rarer in Wisconsin politics to see split partisan results at the top of the ticket. When that used to be common, right? When we had a Tommy Thompson and a Herb Kohl, and there has been kind of a continued tradition of a spread. Tammy Baldwin obviously outran her Democratic colleagues in 2018 by a significant margin, but all Democrats won in 2018. And so I think returning to that, not only are we a purple state and a 50-50 state, but that those independent voters are willing to be split ticket voters, which was not the case in 2010 and 2014, when Republicans were really just ascendant, and not in 2012 when Democrats were just ascendant with those independent voters, but that those independent voters seem to be casting a split ticket ballot. The other thing that I will say just surprised me is, and I just wasn't paying attention to this, but I had no idea that it took that long to count the votes in Nevada. I understood it in California, I understood it in Arizona, but there's still, like, you could have still voted, you could still put something in the mail, like you were today.
What had,
Yeah.
either,
Has to be, they will
They
take
have
them
to
until the
receive it.
15th, they have to receive them by the 15th, but
Yeah,
they
we-
have to be postmarked by election day.
Which is just crazy to me, and they're talking about, still receiving tens of thousands of ballots a day that are coming in that could affect the outcomes of congressional races and the Senate and the governor's race in Nevada, and I didn't know that, so that's what surprised me.
I think my lesson from Tuesday night is it was a lot like a youth soccer tournament. Everybody got a medal. We had a Republican win the US Senate race, we had a Democrat win the gubernatorial race, we had Democrats win both probably the Secretary of State's race, although that's still too close to call, the AG, and then we had a Republican win the treasurer's race. Down ticket, Republicans won as expected. They did get a supermajority in the state Senate, which was expected. They didn't get a supermajority in the state assembly, which frankly was always going to be a long shot, but there were pickups in both houses. So Tony Evers is going to have to deal with bigger majorities. A couple points that Sachin made that I'm going to pick up on. I'll give Gilbert credit. These are the first two statewide races in our history that were both decided by less than 3%. First time that's ever happened. It is the first time we've had a split decision at the top of the ticket since 1998, when Russ Feingold beat Mark Newman and Tommy Thompson beat Ed Garvey. So history didn't predict these things. The national environment suggested a better outcome for Republicans that they didn't get, and frankly that may cost Kevin McCarthy the speakership if they do get to 219. He may not be the guy that's carrying that trophy at the end of the race.
He may not want to be. See Paul Ryan.
but just to pick up on something Bill said, think about this. November 8th, 1994. Tommy Thompson wins the state of Wisconsin with 67% of the vote. 67%. He carries all but one county. And I bet you would all say Dane. He won Dane.
Correct.
He won Dane County. And this time around, what? Evers got 175,000 more votes out of Dane?
I think it was 173, but yeah.
Okay, I'm rounding. And Barnes got 150,000 votes. And Herb Kohl hit 67%. Did he carry Waukesha County?
He did in '94.
Yeah. So that's how far we've come.
And that's a good point and an interesting point, because, as Sachin said, we are a purple state and we are a 50-50 state. We'll get to the gerrymandered nature of the legislature and sort of how sustainable that is. But a couple of other things I wanted to touch on. The US Senate race. If we were not surprised because Senator Johnson was an incumbent, but maybe we were surprised by the size of the margin. We see that Lieutenant Governor Barnes got fewer votes than did Tony Evers, than did Josh Kaul. So was it the candidate? Was it the campaign? What do we think might have shaped that race? And then we could ask the same questions about Tim Michels, because he got fewer votes than did Ron Johnson. He got fewer votes than did Eric Toney. You know, we know that candidates matter, right? I mean, we can look across the country at some of the Republican Senate candidates, and we know that candidates matter. So what was going on in both of those very close races? Is it purely incumbency? Was it the ad campaigns? Was it the candidates themselves? What do we think some of the dynamics at play were?
Well, I happen to think it was a combination, obviously, but the ad campaigns were very effective early on after Mandela Barnes became the nominee in sort of crafting an image to the public who didn't know who he was as somebody who was out of step on some key issues of obviously crime because of cashless bail and some of the statements he had made about some issues in the past. So they basically pummeled him on that advertising in a very short period of time between mid-August and mid-September. And that sort of changed the nature of the race. It put Barnes on the defensive. I'm not saying his positions were incorrect. I'm just saying this is how they were portrayed. There were two super PACs that were involved besides the Johnson campaign that spent about $50 million seeking to fill in who Mandela Barnes was. At least that's how the Republicans saw him, and I think they did it quite effectively. I thought both candidates were good campaigners and gave their best. And you know, I don't know what's worse, losing by 27,000 or 54,000. I don't know if in your head you play a what could I have done, and I'm sure they are, you know, on the Barnes team. I think one other thing Dan Weiss pointed out today in his winners and losers, I think Democrats are ill-served by the types of primaries they run. That these are, there was no contrast, there was no attack, and there were some issues that were going to hit Barnes in the general election that ultimately did, that Democrats would have probably been better off hashing out during the primary process. And that would just be, just as an outsider looking in, I don't know how that is sustainable. The Republicans, as you saw, will rip each other's faces off if they have to win the primary. And I'm not suggesting that, but I think there would have been a better, more robust debate for Democrats would have benefited that party.
I want to add a couple things to what Bill said, and are you taking a buyout? Because you could get a job consulting in politics. I'll have to look at that list again. So I think going along with what Bill said, obviously I think, look, incumbency did have an impact, right? It makes a difference when you look at these races and they're narrow and the incumbents win. I also think spending had an impact. I think that the data, you know, it's still all coming in, but I think it's going to be pretty clear that the Evers side outspent the Michael side pretty significantly, and the Johnson side outspent the Barnes side pretty significantly over the course of the campaign. I think that's where it's going to end up, but the results then align with that, if you think about it. I do think the attacks on Mandela were particularly effective. I think it's important to note the racial component of that. When you're in an 88% white state and you're running an African-American candidate, which with the primary electorate, the Democratic primary electorate did choose Mandela in the competitive primary. I understand that folks dropped out, but that wasn't because anyone pushed him out, it was because they all thought they couldn't win, right? I mean, that was a choice that they made to try to give Mandela that head start on raising money and for that month of getting outspent to not happen. That was really the goal, and it was publicly stated to be the goal, and it was privately stated that that was the goal, and it didn't unfortunately work out that way. The last thing that I'd say about that is that we still have a U.S. Senator today, 2 days after the election, who a significant percentage of Wisconsinites say that they know nothing about. Like, if you look at the data in that last Marquette poll, some of the private data, you have an incumbent who, maybe 10% of voters still didn't have a strong opinion about in Ron Johnson. And I think that probably helped lift him, because when you have a race in which both candidates are trying to make the other untenable, and they didn't successfully make Ron Johnson untenable to those people who didn't have an opinion. And I think that's a really important data point.
And actually, Bill, if you don't mind, if I just, because
Go ahead.
Sachin's a Democratic strategist, there are people who were somewhat critical of the Barnes campaign with the almost purely autobiographical ads and the almost purely positive ads, and whether it's the outside groups or not, so little attention to January 6th and Senator Johnson's role in that. And so, as Bill so aptly put it, Republicans will tear each other's face off, but it seemed as if the negative campaign was much more vociferously negative coming at Barnes than he was putting out or was being put out on his behalf. So absolutely the racial component. How about the rest of it?
I'd say two very quick things about that. I think that the January 6th point is just wrong. I think the data is very clear that the audience for that was highly partisan. I don't think there were any voters that were going to be convinced by that argument who didn't know it really well. If you cared about January 6th and you voted for Ron Johnson because you didn't know anything about him, like that doesn't, there's no alignment there, right? So I think that the idea that they needed to do that on television to the mass market audience is just wrong. I think that the right choices were made there. I think the second point is really about timing, and it's about the fact that he got beat up specifically on crime. Now, I do think they should have been more prepared for that from a timing standpoint, but when you have a month of just getting brutalized, they had to humanize him. And that's where the peanut butter and jelly ad came from and all those kinds of things. And so I understand the concern that people, especially partisans, want to see fight, but I think they were making very rational and smart decisions about how to reach the audience they were trying to reach. They were trying to make Mandela tenable again to independent voters who had concerns. And that wasn't going to happen by him going out and trying to rip Ron Johnson's face off. Now, they were ripping his face off on TV through The Independent and through the outside groups, et cetera. And the campaign did it a little bit as well, especially on abortion, because that's what they saw was going to work. And again, I mean, when you lose by as few votes as they did, I don't think that that was a major strategic error. I think it was more that they just could not recover from what happened kind of through September.
So I think it's fair to say that he was in a box that the other candidates weren't, that he had a particular set of constraints.
I think that that's right.
Yeah.
This may surprise you, but I'm actually going to agree with Sachin. I think that the positive ads
He's not always wrong.
the positive ads at the end are why he closed. He was
Yeah.
down 6,
Yeah.
3 weeks out.
Mhm.
He was down 2, 1 week out. What did he do different? He went positive.
Mhm.
I think the positive ads actually worked for him, and he should have done more of that, probably. So, a couple things. To win statewide, by the way, Jeff pointed out the '94 campaign. I was Tommy's campaign manager in that one, and the county we lost was Menominee County by 22 votes. Who's counting, right?
That's still for us too, huh?
Yeah, to win statewide, you need 3 things: message, organization, and money. That's it, okay? On the money side, the guy who spent the most out of the big 4, and by big 4 I mean US Senate and gubernatorial, was Ron Johnson. He won. The guy who spent the second most was Tony Evers. He won. The guy who spent the third most was Mandela Barnes. He lost. The guy who spent the least was Tim Michels. He lost. Money matters, okay? The 2 guys that spent the most money won. 2, on the organizational side, I'm gonna give Democrats credit. They micro-targeted campuses on the abortion issue that the Republicans didn't see, quite honestly, and it made a significant difference. The Gen Z group is the only group that voted for Democrats this cycle. The only one. Every other demographic voted for Republicans. That wasn't by accident. That was a smart strategy on the part of Democrats that Republicans just missed completely. They missed it. Lastly, on the messaging, there were 2 attacks that I think were fatal for Michels and for Barnes. The crime attacks on Barnes that lasted for 8 weeks were unaddressed, and he could not overcome that, right? You cannot let attacks go that long on television with millions of dollars and thousands of gross rating points behind him and not respond. Massive error. Michels did the same thing on his family company. The attacks on the sexual harassment, if you listen to Tim Michels on The Stump, he had an unbelievable answer on that. An unbelievable answer. But he was giving that answer to 50 people, 100 people, 150. Meanwhile, Tony Evers and his allies were telling millions of people something different. Michels never responded. If that was my family company, my parents' name, I would have deviated. I would have defended him, right? That was a massive error by the Michels campaign.
So Bill made reference to some of the demographic changes and some of the way that vote share is changing. And so we know from Tuesday that Tony Evers overperformed his 2018 margins just about everywhere. And he overperformed in the blue places where he increased his vote share, but he also overperformed by losing by less in a lot of the red places in the wild counties. Tim Michaels underperformed Scott Walker's performance from 2018 in a lot of the red areas. So as the wild counties, perhaps, maybe at the margins as they exist around Milwaukee County, become a little more purple, and as Dane County's population growth continues to explode, what do we see for these dynamics moving forward?
So I'm very curious about that as well. Is it the counties are moving or becoming more diverse between Republicans or Democrats, or was it the issue this time around? You know, I would say in 2018 for the governor's race, the defining issue was healthcare. This time around, I don't think there was one defining issue. Republicans made a big issue out of crime and inflation, as well as accurate vote count, where Democrats really made climate change was one of their top priorities, as well as abortion. So I'm curious, in Waukesha County, Tim Michaels compared to Scott Walker. In 2018, Walker comes out of Waukesha County with 75,000 plus margin. Tim Michaels this time around came out with a 45,000 plus margin. Where did 30,000 votes go for what would have been a Republican governor? So the question is, did they go to Tony Evers because they liked where Evers stood on the abortion issue? Or has the demographics of Waukesha County really changed that much? So that's something I'm going to be looking at, and I'm sure these two guys at the other end of the table have some thoughts on that.
Well, let me give you the numbers. For Republicans, if they want to win statewide, they better figure out Dane County, but I've been saying that for 20 years, and they've done nothing different. But just in three big counties, Dane, Milwaukee, and Waukesha County, the Michaels campaign underperformed Walker's 2018 numbers, and remember, he lost by 42,025 votes.
Total.
Total.
But 30 of those came out of Waukesha, didn't he?
No, the delta between Michael's raw vote
Oh, the raw vote.
was
Okay,
12.5.
I'm looking at the gap.
Yeah, there was definitely a different margin, but the actual delta in Waukesha County was 12,500. In Milwaukee County, it was 26,600. That's how many fewer Michaels got than Walker in 2018, but the total's 42,025. Add on Joan Beglinger, third-party candidate, that's 26,000 more. All of a sudden, you're in the ballpark of things that probably were decisive in the race. Joan Beglinger didn't cost Tim Michaels the race. She is, by the way, if you do the math, the difference between the Eric Toney vote and the Tim Michaels vote, there are a lot of weird theories on the internet about that. That's the difference. Almost to the number. It's about 1,500, 1,800 difference. But Michaels underperformed Walker's numbers his Walker's numbers from 28 should have been table stakes. We got to get that, and then how do we add to it? It wasn't table stakes. Michaels didn't get those in most counties, okay? So we, as Republicans, have a fundamental problem in Dane County. We have not fixed it since Tommy Thompson was governor. We choose not to fix it, I believe. We just ignore it. We think we can run up the totals in, quote, Trump country up north. There aren't enough votes up there. You can't do it. If you want to win statewide, you have to, as a Republican, at least get 30%, that's it. In Dane County, Johnson got 23, Michaels got 21.
Can I ask a question? Why was Michaels not good at this? And why are so many Republicans, insiders, angry with him?
He was an outsider. I would say the team was pretty inexperienced. The outside consultants, who I have a lot of respect for, decided to put a national model on this and just stay the course, right? So it was going to be the economy, which included inflation, crime, and education. No deviation from that. What I said earlier, Bill, there should have been a deviation when mom and dad were attacked, right? That's just fundamental. You have in a pro football game, Matt LaFleur makes adjustments to try and win. This is ultimately about
At
winning.
least he used to.
At least he used to. I mean, you do try and win these things, but when the family's attacked, now it's personal. You have to make an adjustment on that one. They didn't do it. So I think they banked on the national environment that cookie cutter campaign could fit. Wisconsin's different. It always was, it always will be, and you gotta tailor your campaign to here.
So what about the counterfactual of Rebecca Kleefisch?
So I actually want to talk about that part too, in addition to what and first of all, I don't think Bill said anything that I disagree with the whole day, which is not actually uncommon when you're analyzing things, right? Because some of these things are objective. We may have different values and beliefs, right? And we're trying to go out and get those things done, but we're analyzing the facts the same way. I think one thing that's understated is the demographic change in the suburbs that is driven in large part by people moving out of Milwaukee. And so one of the things I've heard is that there are some people, and I think it's especially women, but there are people in the suburbs who are changing their mind. That is 99.9% about Donald Trump and Donald Trump's character and their unwillingness to participate in that. But that's not a massive, massive group, right? He's got pretty strong support amongst Republicans. I think it's more that you have people who might have lived in the city or might have lived in Whitefish Bay or might have lived in Oak Creek or whatever, and they're moving out farther, right? They're getting older. Their kids are getting older. They want to go into a different school system. I've got friends who are in the city who are now out in Economowoc, right? And so those folks are retaining their political values as Democrats, and it is actually having an impact on turnout in the city, which is declining, not growing. The population has been declining. We're trying to turn that around, but like that's a reality. But the performance in Brown Deer, Glendale, Bayside, Maquon, Brookfield are all changing radically and changing quickly, and I think that's having an impact. I think the other thing, and I'm interested in Bill's perspective on this, to the willingness to the extent he's willing to talk about it, is that I think there is still bad blood from that primary. I think that bad blood continued through November 8th. I think it continues today between the Kleefisch and Michaels camps. And it's not just about Trump and not Trump, but there's some other stuff there around, the Walker people and the not Walker people. And you had a number of county parties that were just not engaged in the governor's race in the same way that they were engaged for Ron Johnson and for others. And I think that had an impact. And I think that, again, those things are all inside baseball until you have a race that's decided by 27,000 votes.
Well, and that's the thing, I'd be interested if Bill, if you want to say something about that, but on both sides, right, on the primary for the Democratic side. Some people would argue, and if we want to acknowledge, that the lieutenant governor was in a particular box because of his race, would either of the other candidates have had an easier time on the other side if Tim Michaels' major drawback was that he was an outsider? Rebecca Kleefisch was not. Could she have done something that he didn't? So, in political science, we talk a lot about how primaries might please the party, but they don't necessarily please the general election. And so, on both of these sides, if anybody has any thoughts about that, I think that's an interesting dynamic. We can't unplay it, we can't do the counterfactuals, we could be making things up as we answer those questions, but they are realities.
Let me just say on the Democratic primary, covering that, Democrats really, really, really like Mandela Barnes from the get-go. And so he was going to be very difficult to run against in a primary, and attacking him probably, or contrasting with him probably would have blown up on another candidate. It was a tough thing to do. It was a very good primary field. You have Sarah Godlewski, Alex Lasry, Tom Nelson. I would say probably Godlewski and Lasry, are looking into the future. But ultimately, Democrats really like Mandela Barnes, and I don't think anything changed.
So, common sense comes into this at some point in time, right? And so, a lot of people on the right are saying she would have been a stronger candidate, or Kevin Nichols would have been a stronger candidate. The bottom line is, if Kevin Nicholson or Rebecca Kleefisch were the stronger candidate, they would have won the primary, right? If you can't convince a majority of your own party you're the best candidate, there's no chance you're gonna win the general election. I mean, that's common sense. 2, on Clayfish, did she help in the general? No. But a 90,000 vote gap, I don't think she would have made the difference in that. She probably would have helped in Waukesha County for sure. But he underperformed Johnson, sort of across the board. So I don't think Becky getting involved would have made up that gap, right? There were some other problems that they didn't address, and Sachin spoke to some of them. Some county parties just didn't feel connected to that race. They didn't. And so, I credit Nicholson, Ramthun, Becky for Tim for running. I mean, I thought about it, it's hard. You put your family through a lot to run statewide, so I'm not gonna diss on any of them, but I don't think she was the difference in the general election, and nor do I think she would have won.
I think that for the first time today, I disagree with you a little bit. I hear the common sense argument about you gotta win the primary, and I think at a practical level, it's like, yeah, if you wanna win, you gotta win, right? And so that's a truth. But in both cases, you have an electorate that's significantly different. And I think that it's fair to say that one could look at some of the other Democratic primary candidates and say some of those fundamentals might have been the same, but some of them might have been different. And they would have been hit for Kenosha and defund the police and all those things. Would those attacks have been as effective against someone who is not themselves African American? I think that's a question that is being asked. Now, I like Mandela. He's a friend of mine. I supported him wholeheartly. My wife and I held a fundraiser where we were on board. I was with him on Wednesday when he conceded. I think, he very much reflects the mainstream center of the Democratic Party, right? But you still have to run and win, and you have to get a bunch of people who aren't Democrats. And just like Republicans have to get a few people, at least, who aren't Republicans, to win a statewide election. And I think on the Democratic side, it was about, maybe we picked the progressive in this race. And I want to point out, we don't always. Like, Tony Evers was nowhere near the most progressive in that election. Jim Doyle wasn't the most progressive candidate in his primary, et cetera. So we don't always pick the most progressive candidate. In this primary, we did, collectively. But I think on the Republican side, what I perceive as different is there's just division. I don't know that it's right-center division as much as it is, Trump or not Trump, the party infrastructure versus not the party infrastructure. I think there is some old school Republican, folks like Bill here, who's 30 or 40 years older than me, and those who are the more recent adherents to the Republican ideology. There are some divisions that also play into how they find the way to win a statewide race.
So something both of you have said, and going back to the first question about what surprised you, I guess when I look back, when you look at how much money was spent to get people to vote in this election, and yet turnout is going to be lower in 2022 than 2018. I mean, we're going to be around, the thought was going to be 2.7 and then maybe 2.8. I'm always amazed. We had 3.3 million voters for the presidential, right, just south of that. And think about that, we had fewer than 2.7 million votes for this midterm. Where did 600,000 people go?
Well, and that was sort of my next point, and Sachin touched on this. We were down compared to 2018.
Yeah.
Turnout was down because you can't compare presidential to midterms because of the excitement. But we were down almost everywhere over 2018, particularly in Milwaukee County and in the city.
Right. Was the messages not inspiring enough? Were the candidates not inspiring enough? Were people more driven not to vote because of what they were watching and seeing? It's fascinating to me, because I think going into it, people thought, oh, we could have a higher voter turnout. It didn't happen.
Yeah, that's something that people expected. Nationally, I think people were expecting the same sort of for a midterm overwhelming wave of turnout.
And I haven't seen all the national news. Was that a trend as well?
I think it's the first election in multiple decades where Republicans are actually going to win the national vote.
But was
California's
overall,
not all in yet, but right now we're up by 6%, which is sort of unheard of. But they got the vote where they needed it.
Right.
We did.
Well, and there's one obvious place where turnout was up in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And we've talked about it, Dane County, right?
Yeah.
And that's, now, I don't know whether eligible voter population percentages were up. I haven't looked at that yet, but they've just had phenomenal growth. I mean, this is the fastest growing place in the state, and it's massive. It's huge, right? I mean, there's 600,000 people, I think, in Dane County now, which is, if you guys think about that, when I was in politics, it was a 250,000 person county. Like, that's a massive change in 20 years. And
Wait, so how old are you? That was a
well,
long time ago.
I was a wee lad when I started.
He started young.
So, anyway.
No, I think the turnout piece is interesting and surprising. I mean, especially since in Wisconsin, we pride ourselves on, this good government turnout stuff.
And I'm looking forward to more Craig Gilbert comments. I mean, he's a guy that does a lot of good digging on it.
Sure. So this is maybe a little more inside baseball, but what do people think about Wisconsin 3? Do the Democrats look back and think that that was a missed opportunity? So the 3rd congressional district of Wisconsin, out on the western edge, that used to be Ron Kind's seat, was a Democratic seat, flipped to Republican seat, a pretty Trumpy candidate on the Republican side. Democrat obviously lost by a decent margin. Does the DCCC look back at that one and wish they'd put in more money, or?
I think the word political malpractice can be stated. I think that, if you look,
Yes.
it's not just in the 3rd, they didn't run a candidate against Mike Gallagher. They didn't run a very strong candidate against Brian Stile. If you want to retain some of these or be competitive in some of these areas, you have to run, significant candidates and put money in significantly. And, both parties have great strengths in the state, and they both have great weaknesses, which is why it's a purple state. I mean, they should have put money into the 3rd CD.
But just also what you just said there. Think of what Bill just said. We talked about Wisconsin being a purple state, battleground state. The Senate race decided by 1%, the governor's race by 3%. Yet 2 Republican congresspeople didn't even have an opponent on election day. 2. That surprised me. Democrats could not come up with somebody.
I mean, I think Bill addressed this earlier, is it's a huge burden on your family to run, and it's a huge burden to run and know you're not gonna win, right? I mean, I worked with a candidate in the 5th who beat 65-35, and, you walk into that saying, I'm doing this to carry the flag for our cause, but not with any hope of actually being in Congress, and it's hard. It's a hard decision to make. That said, look, I think a lot of the Democrats really, made some mistakes in the 3rd district. I love Brad. I gave money to all 3 candidates in the primary there. I'm not sure that Brad was the strongest candidate, but I'll tell you who was the strongest candidate, and he chose not to run, and that's Ron Kind. I mean, I think Ron Kind wins that race, and I think he wins it easily. But that's hindsight, right? I mean, things were all moving in the wrong direction. But I think, you look at everything, how it went down, and I don't know how a guy who had been voted for by those same voters, for 20 years, I don't know how he would have lost. But, he made a decision for himself and for his family. I think it's going to be competitive again in 24 when we have a presidential campaign. I think you're going to see a much stronger candidate. In the 1st, I thought Ann was a fine candidate. She just couldn't convince people that she was real and raise the money. It wasn't her personally, right?
I think you guys have given an opening to Brian Stile. I think he was one of the most impressive candidates that I saw as he was toggling back and forth between Michaels and Johnson, and clearly he's going to be going places, and and
I mean, look, he's no Mike Gallagher, but man, nobody thought that was funny. You didn't think that was funny?
No.
Come on. But look, I think you're going to see. Here's what I think you're going to see in the 1st and 3rd. I think you're going to see experienced politicians on the Democratic side running in 2024, whether they're legislators or other local officials, and they're going to be in a much better position to fund a full-fledged effort all the way through to the end in 2024.
I think the DCCC didn't factor in everything that Democrats on the ground were doing. I'll go back to a point I made 40 minutes ago. There are 6 campuses in the 3rd congressional district. lots of young people on those 6 campuses. They were getting micro-targeted on issues like abortion, student loan forgiveness, stuff like that. And PAF, with almost no money, came within 4 points, right? I don't think he's a bad candidate. I think he looks like the district. I think Kine would have been the strongest, but I also thought Al Baldus's daughter was on paper, I thought she was their strongest candidate. What's her last name? Deb McGrath.
The woman who jumped out of an airplane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
For
that was
those
one
who
of the
didn't
most
see the
memorable ads
commercial.
of the whole cycle. I mean, we'll get to that maybe, but the ads were sort of lousy, top to bottom. But I think that DCCC made a massive error by not investing there. And, you know, once you're an incumbent, as it proved on Tuesday night,
It's hard to-
your odds go way up of being reelected.
So one last question I had for the panel before we open things up to the audience, and that is, if Wisconsin is a purple state right now, if the blue population centers are the places where there is growth, if there are fewer people living in the rural areas all of the time, how long can a 50-50 state with a 65-35 gerrymandered legislature tolerate that? How long can we have that tension? And I know literally from the perspective of how impossible it is to change the gerrymander, but the gerrymander here is so deep. How does that play out in our politics and in our culture for the foreseeable future?
I think there's somebody up here who can answer that.
Well, look, I'd say 2 things about that. One is, I immodestly would say I know a lot about gerrymandering and redistricting. There is no doubt in my mind that the Republicans would still hold majorities in both houses of the legislature, even if we had totally fair maps, even if we had slightly leaning Democratic maps. I mean, the reality is that in 2011, the Republicans had probably about a 2% advantage, just in straight, if you had a completely fair 50-50 map. That had probably grown to 4 or 5 points because people aren't static, and Donald Trump has changed the equation, completely changed the equation in rural and exurban Wisconsin, has also changed the equation in suburban Wisconsin, but actually less so, although there's more people and there's more growth there. But people aren't static, I guess is the second thing that I'd say. And so I think it actually could be like this for forever. I don't think there's any reason it can't be like this forever. And the reason is that people will change, right? It's possible Democrats have maxed out Dane County, right? And if the Republicans start to compete there, and they even peel 10% of the people away, the entire dynamic changes, right? I think we'll continue to see diversity and population growth in the Milwaukee suburbs. They will get more blue over time. I think, in 2024, the Democratic presidential candidate will probably win the city of Brookfield. They're going to win Waukesha County, but we're going to keep making, Brookfield's the next Wauwatosa. Mequon's the next Bayside. Those are the kinds of things that are going to happen. But long term, unless something fundamental changes, I think we're going to be a 50-50 state for quite a long time.
So there's some important details. Sachin and I were on the opposite sides of this. He was with the Fair Maps Coalition, I was with a group called Common Sense Wisconsin. Joe Hendrick was our executive director. What always is lost in this debate is which maps went to the United States Supreme Court. Tony Evers drew the maps that went to the United States Supreme Court. They approved one of them, the congressional map. So the map that was, the election on Tuesday night was held on a Tony Evers map for Congress. They remanded or sent back the legislative map to the state Supreme Court, who had 3 choices: approve Evers' map, approve the Republican map, or draw their own. Most people thought they would draw their own. They ultimately wasted so much time because they couldn't figure out a path that they just picked the Republican map. Those are the maps we're working off, but the details behind that are really, really important.
The details being that the
details
Supreme
being,
Court
yeah,
chose them,
yes,
and the Supreme Court chose them.
they chose the Republican map as being the one that.
Sure, because the state Supreme Court represents the Republicans.
That's a theory.
No, you're
That's
saying
a
US
theory.
Supreme Court.
The US Supreme Court
Right.
chose the congressional map.
Right.
They did not choose the
But the state
Right.
Supreme Court chose
Correct.
the Republicans.
That is right.
And
Yeah.
so it is a theory that the state Supreme Court, being much more conservative, chose the Republican maps.
Correct.
That's a theory. Sure.
I don't even know what to say to that. Yes.
Neither
Those
do I.
are all factual statements.
Right.
But if they had chosen Evers' map, what would have looked different on election night?
Not much.
We would have won the 5th. and we would have
Oh,
won
yeah,
the
we
13.
would've won
We
the
would have won Senate 5, and we would have won Assembly 13, and Assembly 84 would have been in play. I mean, it would have been.
Well, it
here's
wasn't
the
play anyway.
84. I'm sorry, 24 would have been in play.
84 is your old seat, right?
Yeah.
82, but
It-
84
but-
was only less than 1%.
Yeah, and the new 84 is really your old 82nd,
Yeah.
Jeff. But what I'd say is the Republicans don't have a supermajority in the Assembly. They have a pretty big majority. That would have still been true. I think they probably would have fallen 1 seat short in the Senate of a supermajority. That also is candidate dependent. Like, I don't know, if Jessica had been the candidate, maybe, Hutton beats her anyway. I don't think he beats Tom Palzowitz in what was the 5th, last cycle. Because we only lost, Julie Hensley only lost that race by 1.5 points. And if you look at the demographic change, that was just moving in the other direction very rapidly, right? So, again, inside baseball, right?
Yeah.
But big picture, do we have big Republican majorities? Yeah, we have big Republican majorities. And again, in a 50-50 election in this state with a fair map, we will have Republican majorities in the legislature. They wouldn't be nearly as big. They're not going to be 2/3, right? And some of that will be more candidate quality dependent on the margins. But the facts are the facts in terms of how the population is distributed. You can only break up Dane County and Milwaukee County so much. And again, the 2011 map, really it made the difference, right? I think in 2021, the map alone didn't make the difference, is what I would say.
I would agree with that.
All right, we've got about 20 minutes, so if anyone from the audience, yes?
Yeah, this question for everybody. Is there any reason to be optimistic that things will change with this new state legislature? The governor's already talking about calling more special sessions, which they will gavel in and gavel out. We don't know if Robin Voss will continue to be speaker. Do any of you have any optimism that anything will change legislatively in the two sides? We'll have a new sense of coming to the table to work together, which is what voters have said time and again they want. Is there any reason to believe that that might happen with this new legislature?
I don't think I have optimism, but I will state something that I think is true, which is that both sides have some responsibility there. And they have to see it as in their interest. And I think the problem is that if you are the Democratic wall to a bunch of bad Republican things, there's not a lot of incentive to work with the Republicans to get something done. By the same token, if you're the Republicans and you've got 2/3 or almost 2/3 of the legislature doing things the way you've been doing things, what's your incentive? Maybe Lindsey Graham can come here and say what he said the other day, which is that we should be able to get some stuff done now. I mean, that's the way he said it, right? So, I don't know. I think this is a really big challenge because the political incentives on both sides are so disparate. They're so opposite one another. It's very different than the Tommy Thompson era where those political incentives were aligned. And frankly, you had a governor who wanted to have 70% approval, and that was the goal, I think, at some level. And that isn't I don't think there's a lot of politicians out there who have that vision of who they are and how they want to operate. If we did, then I think things would be a little bit different. I think we see that at the local level, right? I think you have, obviously he's a client, so I don't want, but I think the Cavalier Johnsons of the world think that way, right? But I don't think it's super common across the state to approach the job that way.
I think the one wild card out there, so that it's not just performance art politics, is that the Republican convention is coming here in 2024. So maybe with that as a lever, there could be some movement on some things locally for Milwaukee. I'm not guaranteeing that. I'm just saying that's one aspect, or that's one big date that lies out there. So it's probably good for everybody that Milwaukee comes across as a good place for both Republicans, for Milwaukee, and for the state of Wisconsin.
So I'm so glad you asked this question because this is where, coming out of the Tommy Thompson era, the Herb Kohl era, sort of this, let's find a way to work together. I mean, I think it might have been Tip O'Neill who said, politics is the art of compromise. But what incentive is there really right now for the Republican legislature to compromise? And I'm always fascinated by this process on how Republicans and Democrats find a way to come together. You know, the Pew Research did an interesting study, and they asked Republicans and Democrats what they think of each other. So let me lay out this scenario. Imagine Bill and Sachin get on an elevator. They don't know each other. Bill is wearing a button that says, "Hi, I'm a Republican." Sachin is wearing a button that says, "Hi, I'm a Democrat." And if they do what normal people do on an elevator, they're not talking to each other. But here is what Bill is thinking of Sachin. He's closed-minded. He's dishonest. He's immoral. And so Sachin's there looking over at Bill, and here's what he's thinking. According to the Pew Research, he's closed-minded. He's dishonest. He's immoral. Well, what conversation is going to get off the ground if they both think of each other that way? You're not going to get a lot done. These two guys have had more in common here today than what we may see in the legislature. And Republicans and Democrats do have a lot in common. But I also think, and curious to hear what they say, I think the penalty is bigger for a Republican or a Democrat to compromise within their own party. It's not like the other side's going to get mad at them. Their own team's going to get mad at them. And I don't know how or when we move past that.
Great question. I would say Jeff Schmoller would remember this, maybe Kathy. Tommy Thompson had Democratic majorities for the first 7 years he was governor. Most of his biggest accomplishments came in those first 7 years. His theory was you got 2 ears and one mouth, you use them in that proportion. And he taught all of us that. So we found a way to strike that balance. A governor has more levers of power than the legislature at any day on at any time, right? You gotta know how to use them. I would argue that this special session tactic is bad, really bad, especially when you're 0 for 13, which Tony Evers is. The better way to do that is to set the goal. Here's what I wanna get done. And then deploy your team to work with Voss and Lemieux to get those things done. I was pretty encouraged driving over here this morning. I listened to Robin Voss on Jay Weber, and he talked about this actually. He talked about finding common ground with the governor on education, which I would argue is the most important issue in Wisconsin, and definitely it should be in Milwaukee. He talked about, well, the governor wants to put more money in public schools. We want to do universal choice. Maybe we can find a balance. And that was music to my ears because that's how I was taught, right? And I think the Republicans will be more strategic about this as long as the governor is, right? If the governor just puts his foot on the gas with special sessions that are going nowhere and unwillingness to meet with them, they haven't met in 2 years. Very few. When Tommy Thompson found that out, he was flabbergasted that the Republican leadership and the governor hadn't met for 2 years. You can't have that. They got to meet weekly. They're going to agree on 10% the first week, maybe 5. But by the end of the first year, they might agree on 40, right? And let's find that 40 and let's figure that out and get that done.
20 would be a huge improvement.
20 would be a huge improvement.
So, but signature legacy pieces for Thompson, he needed Democrats.
He had that Democrats.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So the other place of possible compromise or if signs, I think, could be, will there be a new conversation with Crowley and Cavalier making the case for Milwaukee and the county around the sales tax issue and the conversation that I think will be more statewide around shared revenue?
100% yes. I believe that, and these are Sachin's clients, I think David and Chevy have done an amazing job of building relationships quickly with members of the legislature, including the leadership. They were doing the same thing with Michaels in the event he would have won. I don't know if they'll get a sales tax or if they'll get more of a tourism kind of tax like they have in the Dells, which may make more sense, doesn't generate as much revenue, but it is a new revenue source. But I'm hopeful that they're going to find, there will be a new funding formula for shared revenue. There will be changes in that. I'm confident Republicans understand that, you know, a model that's 50 years old and has never been modified, in fact has been cut multiple times under Democrat and Republican governors, it's time for some change.
I mean, the best example of that is, what our Washington County executive has to deal with, right? So Josh put out a budget that was reliant on a referendum passing, the referendum didn't pass, and now they're in a real hard spot, right? And it's because of shared revenue cuts, and that's, and again, just so people, shared revenue is a very inside term. This is the money that the state collects from people in communities through primarily income tax, but also the sales tax, and it's just about returning those revenues to the localities where the people live to fund those services, because the way we fund those services is through a state collected tax. Most other states, they don't do it that way. You tax local people, local municipalities or counties or whatever keep that money, and then they pay for local services. That's how they do it in Chicago, right? So yeah, the taxes are high, but people there are choosing that, and they're paying for their own services. Here we don't do it that way, and it's broken. And it's broken in Republican places, it's broken in Democratic places, it's broken in rural places, suburban places, urban areas. Obviously, suburbanites have been, because of property values, have been the easiest to overcome that by passing local referendum, both for schools and for local services. And so, but I'll tell you, if you're in a rural community in Wisconsin and you're worried about your roads or transportation or education or anything else, you are going to need to get more money from the state. And it's not a gift, right? It's just returning the money into those communities that those people are paying in taxes, that right now the state is using for state programs that may or may not benefit the people in those communities. And so I think there's going to be bipartisan agreement. We have to do something about it. Let's see if the leaders can be leaders and get it done.
Yes.
So, looking forward, I have so much going through my head. I think of the abortion issue and the WOW counties and how the abortion issue, I don't think perhaps rose as high on people's radar as it probably should have, with Republicans and Democrats, because there's a lot of Republicans who believe, they may say that they're pro-choice, but they're actually perhaps personally pro-choice and not necessarily forcing it. I'm just wondering, when I look at the issues going forward, what are the Republicans doing to really attract and talk to younger people? We know that climate change is important. We know that rights are important. My concern is looking forward. I have a lot of nieces and nephews. I spend a lot of time with them. I work for an institution that has lots of students. How will the Republicans be talking to younger people to make that connection and make politics relevant to them, for them to want to engage in the Republic?
It's a great question. I don't know that we know the answer today. I think it was more of a factor on Tuesday night than folks on my side want to give it credit for. If I were advising the legislature, I would pass an abortion bill with rape and incest exceptions before the Supreme Court race, so that it's not the #1 issue in the Supreme Court race in April. I don't know that they will do that. I mean, frankly, if they passed a 15-week ban, I think you would take it off the table forever. But the votes aren't there in the Republican majority.
But even like with climate change, we have to accept the fact that students care about that, young people care about it, and so where's the balance? So I just see that there's so many issues out there, because the Republican Party is getting old, and we need to look at those younger people coming up.
You're asking about climate change on a 74-degree day in November?
I think it's 84 in here.
Look, I'm not in the business of giving Republicans advice, but I think if the Republicans returned to their roots, especially around business, they would see that every one of their constituents in the business community thinks man-made climate change is real, and they either have to do something about it or they have to take advantage of it from a business standpoint, and they definitely need to accommodate those realities within their business planning. And if the Republican Party did that, it would change the dynamic in politics. But let me give a warning to Democrats, which is that I think the Democrats are under this belief that if 18 to 29-year-olds today care about the things that they care about and are voting Democrat, that they're locked in Democrats for life. And that just isn't true. And if you look at the movement, especially amongst Latinos, look, I still think we're getting a majority of Latino votes on the Democratic side. We're sure as hell getting a lot fewer of them, percentage-wise, than we used to. And if you look at what happened in Florida and what's happening in some of these other places, Texas is another one, where Republicans are really trying to attract Latino voters in significant ways, even in Milwaukee to some degree, although there's many fewer here to deal with. It's folks aren't static, right? And these political identities are not static. There's Republicans in this room who didn't vote for Republican candidates on Tuesday and don't like Donald Trump. And there are Democrats in this room who 20 years from now will say, well, here are the things I care about today. And so I think, if the mistake any party can make is to think they should fight the last election instead of the next election. And that's good advice for anybody. And it's good advice for anybody in any part of life, whether it's politics or not, right? Looking to the future, not the past, is the right way forward. So.
Okay, got time for one last question.
As a member of Milwaukee Rotary, I heard a talk by Mr. Michaels who used one of the most compelling tales that I've ever heard in politics. He told about meeting the grandmother of the 3-month-old child who was taking care of that child because his mother was murdered, 26-shot murder, and the perpetrator, the father of the child, being killed on Water Street. And that child, when he grows up, would go to one of 6 public schools with a 0 report on reading, 0 score on reading. And he obviously did the tale for his own political purposes. So the question on the table, and as we know that charter schools are under fire in Milwaukee for political reasons, even ones that are super performing. So if education is an issue for the city, in the state of D, and if innovation, especially after COVID, we've seen the consequence of the system, the structure, the culture of education. What does Milwaukee do? What do Republicans, Democrats do? What does the governor and legislature and the mayor do about education? Milwaukee, prior to 2024, that sends a signal that we know the system's not working and we're going to try something different in Wisconsin. Calling upon what Bill was talking about, the innovation of a Pat Lucy or Tommy Thompson. I heard the Democratic chairperson talk about the innovation of Tommy Thompson. So if that's the issue, Milwaukee's the place, 24 is the year, what happens before that to say it's time for a change and make it happen?
My answer would be literacy. Teach kids to read. If everybody in this room who's done anything in politics for the last 20 years, we always used to make fun of Mississippi. They were 50th or 51st, depending on if you include Puerto Rico, for school performance, right? They're now in the top 25. Why? They invested in literacy. They made a substantial investment in the science of reading, is what it's called, to teach kids how to read at a beginning age. If we did that, Jeff, crime would go down over time. Healthcare would improve over time. It's the best investment we can make, and I'm confident there could be a bipartisan agreement to get that done.
I'm not going to disagree with literacy. I think that investment in education across the board is important. I don't think we need to fight the last fight. I think we need to fight the next fight. I don't know that I agree that charter schools are under fire. I think that voucher schools still are a flashpoint in Milwaukee politics. I don't know that charter schools are the same way. I mean, you have a mayor and a county exec who are pretty supportive, and CFC that's got a new leader and it's growing and has much broader support than it used to. My problem with stories like that is, the 0% reading thing is just not a true fact. These are schools that opted out of the test, right? So it shows up as 0, it doesn't mean that it's at 0. And obviously, COVID had an impact across the board. That's not unique to Milwaukee, that's a national problem, and maybe even an international problem, right? That's gonna be a problem. Our side obviously wants to spend more money on public schools. Republicans like school choice. The reality, and I've talked to people on both sides about this, is that universal school choice doesn't mean that we don't need to invest in public schools because there's no capacity in the private system to suddenly take on the entire public school system. So I think you've got to do all of the above. I'm not a big fan of vouchers, but I think you got to put kids first. And at the end of the day, the reality is that we spend less in Milwaukee per student than we do in any of the suburban districts around Milwaukee, and we have a different problem of poverty, of transportation, of all those kinds of things. And so the reality is it is going to take more money, and I don't think just reform of education is the only answer. but I also don't think that that means that we should just throw money blindly at it and not insist on some sort of results. And results maybe even beyond tests. I think again, it has to be an all of the above strategy. The problem I see politically, beyond the partisan fight between a governor and a legislature that are completely at war with one another, is that there's a fundamental concern about spending money on the legislature's part. And when you have a $5 billion surplus, and we're not spending that money on things that would improve people's lives, we're kind of stuck. And we could return some of the money to taxpayers and still spend $3 billion and really have an impact on people's lives, right? We could solve laterals and fix shared revenue and fund schools and give people a tax cut. There's enough money to do all those things, but we haven't been able to do it. And I'm here's to hoping that we can see a different path in the next budget in the next 2 years until we get to the 24 election. I think that's what it's going to come down to.
Well, and given that Milwaukee is one of the major economic drivers of the city, people being willing to invest in addressing poverty and healthcare and transportation and things like that would go a long way to helping, in conjunction with education reforms, to fix underlying problems. And we stand here at UWM, which is an open access institution, which exists to provide education opportunities broadly, but most of our students are from Milwaukee City and Milwaukee County. And we didn't even touch on the way that the university system has been hampered, right? So it is a multi-level and multi-layered problem, and it's not as simple as trying to create a few more charter programs, right? There are systemic things that, as Sachin suggests, we have happily ignored as a state. All right, so that is the limit of our time today. It's certainly not the limit of the conversation. So I thank everybody on the panel. I thank the audience, and particularly Jeff and WISP Politics for this opportunity.
Thank you.